you, if those of you in the room, if you attended the opening session, you probably heard a lot of the personal stories that people were sharing. I know for me that really means a lot, and for all of us on this panel. So we wanted to kind of ground us all in our personal stories before we get started. So I'd like to ask the room, how many of you, either you yourself or a loved one, have had an experience being prescribed a brand new medication or were even in a clinical trial? Anybody in the room? I see a couple. I know for me personally, this happened about 7 years ago when my father was diagnosed with a terminal rare lung disease and was prescribed a medication that was brand new to the market. And because of my experience in healthcare, my parents were fortunate that I could help them navigate getting the drug approved through his insurance, getting bridge coverage put in place so that he could start therapy quickly, and then even being with him on several ER visits where the attending physician had never heard of this therapy before. These are the types of kind of end user challenges that our group, our teams that we lead, are doing work behind the scenes to try to help mitigate, to help patients get on the drug that they've been prescribed quickly, affordably, and commence with their therapy. For me personally, my father passed 2 years ago, but I do believe that this medication that he had made his quality of life better in those final 5 years. And for a lot of the patients that we help, that is what we're hoping for. We're hoping to improve their outcomes, improve their longevity, improve their quality of life. So with that, I will get us into our agenda. There we go. We're going to go through and introduce each of ourselves in a little bit more detail, and then George is going to tell you a little bit about Biologics, our history as an organization, and our why. Then he'll talk about partnering with biopharma manufacturers in the timeline of bringing a product to launch. Sally will talk about navigating access with payers, and then it will come back to me to talk about how we get the word out to providers. So as I said, or as I was introduced, my name is Terry Swepston. I lead the provider sales organization for Biologics by McKesson. I've been with the organization for 8 years. My team engages at the site of care, whether that is a community oncology practice, a health system. We could be talking to clinicians, nurses, physicians, or those that are in the process of authorizing the drug, financial assistance, prior authorization specialist, pharmacist, pharmacy techs. We are trying to get communication out to all of these stakeholders to make sure that patients get the therapy that they need. I've been in this industry, like I said, for my entire career, either in working for pharmaceutical manufacturers or specialty pharmacy, always in provider-facing roles. So I'll hand it over to Sally.
Sure. Sorry, I was thinking we went to George, but it doesn't matter. You're going to hear from all of us at some point anyway. So my name is Sally Riegel, and I lead the team that does our contracting, credentialing, enrollment with all of the different payers, whether it's commercial, Medicare, Medicaid, and it's an interesting little jungle working through that. But I have been at Biologics for 2 years. However, I have spent over 20 years in the specialty space. And I wanted to come back to the specialty pharmacy area because that would put me much closer to the work that we do and being able to see really the results of a lot of that firsthand. Biologics, being focused on oncology and rare disease, was actually kind of my first choice and has a special place in my heart. My nephew was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 2 years old. And dealing with having to navigate through multiple treatments, therapies, benefits, insurance, all of that is daunting in the best of times, let alone when you're reeling from a cancer diagnosis of a 2-year-old child. So our family pulled together and became his advocates. And I'm happy to say he is 30 years old now, and he just recently married his longtime girlfriend a couple of weeks ago. So we definitely benefited, and we were on the fortunate side of that.
Hello, everybody. My name is George Pascal. I head up business development for Biologics, and what that means for our organization is that I have the privilege to work with our biopharma partners very early on in the process on, just how do you partner as a biopharma manufacturer with a specialty pharmacy, right? And we work in some of the most complex corners of the industry, oncology, rare disease. It's getting increasingly complex. And so how do you work with a pharmacy like a Biologics or a specialty pharmacy that has invested in high-touch services to really bring support and care to patients critically, but also providers, advocacy groups, collaborating with advocacy groups, and really in my role, how do I tether all that together to form a really fruitful partnership with biopharma? And it's a privilege to be in the position that we're in. We are on the front lines of caring for patients, but it's a big responsibility. So we're very thoughtful in the way that we engage with our partners so that we really can keep patients as our North Star. And Terry, I think that's a good transition to our next slide. And, we like to start all of our conversations really with some foundational thoughts around why do we do what we do? Some of you may know Simon Sinek before he's probably littered your LinkedIn feeds with his words of wisdom today. But years ago when he was cultivating his idea of start with why, he struck up a partnership with our president at the time. And his perspectives on, what you do and how you do it is obviously very important. And we're going to spend some time talking about that today, obviously. But it's not until there's a clarity of mission and why you do what you do until really the how and the what becomes special, right? So, when we think about partnering with anybody that we partner with in this complex ecosystem, we always tether ourselves to why we do what we do, and that's for us taking care of patients in some of the most challenging times of their lives. Blue Cross Blue Shield did a study some years ago that showed cancer patients in their first year of diagnosis will see somewhere between 12 and 14 unique providers, and that's just providers, right? That's on top of your family, your insurance company, your job, the things that really you want to spend most of your time focusing on. So Biologics, it's paramount for us and pharmacies that we see as peers that we leverage our skills as a multidisciplinary team to really insulate patients from a lot of these challenges. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the how and the what, but for us, it is really critical that when we partner, it's our clarity of mission, our North Star is the patient and their success is felt by our partners, and that's really a very important message for us. So Terry, can you move on to the next slide? So I'm going to speak a little bit about how we as a pharmacy work with biopharma, as Terry mentioned. And it's a lengthy process, and I think we all know that for pharma, getting to the point of having to think about introducing a therapy into the real world setting seems to probably be the end of a long road of clinical trial development. I mean, that is a huge journey. From proof of concept to the necessary fundraising to moving it through the appropriate phases, the design, the setbacks, right? How do you navigate that? And then all of a sudden, boom, you have commercialization needs. The real world is on the cusp. You're submitting your NDA. So you're scrambling in many cases for some smaller companies, or you're trying to figure out how to do it right for some larger companies to build this ecosystem support for really complex therapeutics. And you find yourself at that point to really say, I need to find partners. And especially pharmacies play a really special role in that space. And we get to be involved because in the corners of the market that we're in, oncology and rare disease, it's wrought with complexity, right? And so the manufacturers will find themselves saying, hey, like these are all of these things I need to solve for. How do I do it? And that's where we get to step in and join that conversation. Often early in the process, 12 to 18, 24 to 48 months out from a potential approval, it's just a furious whiteboarding of how do we get this right for patients. So some of the questions that the biopharma partners are asking is just how do we solve for these complexities? You have clinical complexities. You have a challenge potentially with adverse events, and how do you mitigate that? How do you deploy services around adherence? to really ensure patients receive the maximum benefit of the therapy by staying on it appropriately, not running into an adverse event as a reason to discontinue. These are often self-administered drugs, right? How do I leverage my pharmacy partners with their frontline clinicians to engage my patients when they're not in my direct care? A physician may ask, and pharma is thinking about those questions. So we help them with thinking through this. So logistics, right? Do we have this cold chain product? Is it ambient? Are there complex routes of administration? Are these self-injectables with unique cadence of administration? Or is there dosing challenges, weight-based dosing, high pill burden? These are all factors that come into play for these products that need to be solved for, right? These are patients that they're in the fog of diagnosis. Maybe they're a pediatric patient and the family is just trying to come to terms with this change in their life. So the biopharma comes to partners like Biologics who have done this, right? We have this experience. For the better part of 30 years, we've been focused on oncology and rare disease, and there's never been a time where we haven't been focused on launching a new program, and each one is unique and requires us to leverage our learnings and experiences to really kind of funnel that success into future partnerships. So Terry, we'll go to the next slide. A little bit about what that looks like. So we've gotten there. We've introduced this conversation. We're whiteboarding these complexities and how to solve for them, pulling from analogous experience. And so we're moving into the design phase, right? Working with biopharma is important. And due to the complexity of many of these therapeutics, we're often talking about decisions from biopharma partners that say, we want to work with either a highly limited number of pharmacies or even in some instances exclusively partner with a pharmacy like Biologics. And we're fortunate to support 20 therapies as an exclusive specialty pharmacy today, which is an enormous responsibility, but really asks us to really say, okay, we have to be sure that we're solving for all of these complexities the right way and to meet the lofty demands of these patients and providers. So we engage early and we develop thoughtfully. We use that runway of time, right? We say, how do we contract for appropriate services that we think are going to get the requisite amount of engagement with these stakeholders to really ensure that there's a clarity around process, the patients have a clear understanding of how to work with a pharmacy. We build those business rules, right? We determine on how we're going to measure success, capture data and insights from the real world and relay them back. So we spend that time thoughtfully developing and building this partnership. And in hopes that we think will get us about 95% of the way there, right? We're not in the real world yet, but we think we've developed an ecosystem of support that's really going to be what the patients and providers need when the FDA does give the green light. And when they do give the green light, we're ready. So moving into that next bucket, that first 180 days where we want to really be in a hypercare environment, gathering as much insights as we possibly can from the market, assessing, we got ourselves 95% of the way there. Do we feel like we're close to 100 with some real world adjustments? Or do we need to be flexible to adjust the way that we collaborate with these critical stakeholders? So this is where we're really in that phase of assessing that, the kind of the volatility that these products may face in those early days or how are payers how the prioritization process going? Are providers adopting, the processes appropriately? Do they need education? How are patients doing? Right? What is some of that frontline feedback that we're getting from nurses and pharmacists as we engage patients? Do they need additional support? Or are they supported the right way? This is that really important moment that we really want to navigate away from those rocks that potentially could cause challenges in the real world. And if we've done our job the right way and we feel like we've gotten close to 100% success and it's humming along, we get ourselves into a steady state phase, and that's really where our account management team partners long term with biopharma, and they come alongside to really be that kind of longitudinal long-term air traffic controller to make sure that we're monitoring and ensuring that all of the stuff that we designed is continuing to support the patients and providers the way that it was intended. And if we need to change over time or prepare for label expansions or prepare for maybe a new drug launch that could leverage some of the effort that we had previously done for the first product, that's where they're really monitoring that partnership through business reviews and really also thinking about innovation, right? How do we leverage 30 years of experience on knowing how to navigate many of these therapies, but I think we all know that this landscape is not getting any simpler. It's extraordinarily fragmented. There's a lot of question marks, regulatory changes. How do we kind of stay ahead of the curve for the betterment of these patients? That is where we want to continue to be an incubator for innovation with our partners in biopharma. Right? We got to stay ahead of the curve. We got to continue to keep that patient as the North Star, which is critical, and help think through their lens, right? Their lens and their family's lens on, how do we come around them with that multidisciplinary team, with that focus on innovation, to really ensure that, as the market changes and the landscape changes, they get to focus again on what's most important to them. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sally to talk about ensuring access with our payer partners.
Thank you, George. So going back to Cherry's question at the beginning about how many of you have maybe had an experience with perhaps a new drug, or maybe even just simply cancer or a rare disease condition, and you probably worked with a specialty pharmacy. Anyone? Friends, family? All right. So that experience may have been good, may have been bad, somewhere in between, or some combination of all, but it most likely was impacted by some of the work that goes on kind of, quote, behind the scenes. And that is where a lot of what biologics really does in order to help the patient journey and the patient access journey to move through. So as George talked about, there's a lot of work that goes into getting a drug out, getting it manufactured. It was talked a little bit about at the opening session as well, about it takes a lot of time to go through all that R&D and to get a drug to the point where it gets approved by the FDA and it gets launched. The work, however, doesn't stop there. So it's great that we get the drug out there, but we've got to be able to get it to the patients, and the patients have to be able to afford it in some way, shape, or form. That's where insurance comes in. And as much as it was referred to as a fern on the table this morning, it is really a critical part of our healthcare system today. And without it, folks like Samantha, who said that she cost $1 million last year, she wouldn't be able to be here. We wouldn't have the benefit of her here, and particularly at this summit, if she wasn't able to afford that. And a lot of that comes through insurance. So while it's not always our best friend, we still have to work with it. And that's part of the role of what my team does and how we work together at Biologics. So when these different products come out, it's not always the same as an easy path. So we love when we get a script and we check the patient's insurance and their eligibility and their benefits, and the drug is covered, and we run a claim and it's payable, and we get it shipped out the door to them, and it's great. That doesn't usually happen with a new drug, particularly because so many of these coming out now are really complex, and there's a lot that goes into it. So as you can see on the slide, in that first bucket, we kind of run into sort of like 3 different types of scenarios that are really our most challenging. We run into things like NDC not covered, pharmacy not contracted, exception required. So a lot of those things, let's talk about a couple of those independently here. This happens quite often with the commercial side. It also happens with government payers, but we see it a lot on the commercial side. That NDC not covered can stem from a variety of things. It could relate to the timing of the drug of the release, when Metaspan and First Data Bank have that updated, the frequency of their feeds out to the payers. They may not have it in their system, that they're not recognizing it. It's also possible that they haven't gone through and reviewed the drug. So most commercial payers have some form of a P&T committee or a specialty committee. They often meet monthly. And so the timing of when these drugs launch and hit, it could be 2 days after they just met. It could be 2 days before they meet. So a lot of times that timing and that review is impacted by the timing of those committees. And depending on how quickly the drug goes through the FDA approval process, they may or may not have had some time to actually do some pre-review of what's been submitted to the FDA, what it looks like in terms of its approval, and make some of those coverage decisions. One of the other pieces up there is about pharmacy not contracted. This can also impact in a variety of things. And if you're not aware, PBMs have a multitude of pharmacy networks. There's a wide variety of them, and those networks range from things that are broad and global, kind of like a retail network, to more limited, narrow, and even custom networks where a patient is required to use a certain pharmacy. Unfortunately, that pharmacy may not always have access. George was talking about the importance with the manufacturers to make sure that they partner with a specialty pharmacy who can handle all the intricacies, the clinical needs, the support of those patients. And for that reason, they often limit and restrict the access to the medication. Apologies, I've been under the weather, so got a little frog, a little nasally, bear with me. But it is because of that that sometimes we run into a situation where it's pharmacy not contracted. Because Biologics works with our payers so frequently, we have a really great relationship with them, and we are able to work with them to overcome a lot of this. During the contracting process, sometimes we have to negotiate a rate with them. It can take time, but even if we do it quickly, they also have to load their system. And until that system is loaded, we will continue to see a pharmacy not contracted. It's those situations where we know we have everything rolling and moving forward that we reach out and work with them to put in some sort of override or come up with a solution so that we can get this medication into the hands of the patients as quickly as possible. So as we continue to move through, our goal, like George said, is always with the patient at the forefront. How do we help get them the medication that they need as quickly as possible, and also help ensure that they're not going to run into issues from that coverage perspective? The next item up there is the Medicaid NDRA. Touched on this a little bit earlier. If you're not familiar, NDRA stands for National Drug Rebate Agreement. And it is a component that is filed by the manufacturers when they do their filing for FDA approval. It actually ties back to a lot of the rebates and the subsidy that is coming back to the state plans in order for them to be able to help support and cover the cost of a lot of these medications. So it's a critical piece, and if the manufacturer is a little bit delayed in getting that submitted, that approval comes a little later. The state plans don't add these drugs into their lists. They don't put them on their formularies until that NDRA is approved, and then it moves forward. So we often see, again, a lot of this NDC not covered during this interim time while that NDRA is being approved. Typically, if everything is submitted timely, that approval happens within 2 to 3 weeks of launch. And so we typically only have a little bit of that gap in there for a few weeks. In that interim, we at Biologics will work back with the manufacturers to come up with a plan, help get them that first fill until that NDRA is approved so that they can start on that therapy. As George had mentioned before, a lot of these are really complex, and sometimes these therapies are like the first of their kind for a particular treatment. Patients and families have been waiting a long time to get them, and we understand that and the importance of getting them started on those medications right away. So again, the relationships with the biopharma, working back with them, helping to get them that first medication. And then once it's approved, we work with the state plans and managed Medicaid plans to ensure coverage and help make sure they're able to get that medication. The last bucket you see there is around prior authorization. And I'm sure that almost everybody in this room has had to deal with prior authorization at one point or another in their lives. The thing about prior authorization, because it happens commercial and government plans, it kind of acts as a little bit of a check and balance, just to make sure that everything is aligned. We've got the right information, we've got the right clinical information. They do that to review, ensure the time on treatment, et cetera, and make sure that everything is appropriate for this patient. So it can take a little bit of time and it can take work. And unfortunately, more often than not, that prior authorization has to be submitted by the prescriber or the provider. Sometimes it's a lot of work. They definitely have the clinical notes. It can be kind of burdensome, and that's where we at Biologics like to come in and try and help ease that burden and take on as much of that process as possible for them to get that all started, to help get that expedited and move through so that that prior auth gets approved. We know that it's kind of burdensome, and that's where we want to, again, take that opportunity to sort of ease that burden, whether it's with the prescriber, whether it's with the patient, whatever, the insurance. We want to try and make this as smooth as possible. Our strong relationships with the prescribers that Terry's going to talk about here in a minute are really what help us to work best and advocate for the patients and help get these things moving through. So our goal is to try and sort of be the feet of the duck under the water, churning, working super hard and fast, but to keep things smooth on the top for the patients, their families, the advocates, everyone involved. It's hard enough having to contend with diagnosis of a really horrible condition. If somebody else can help out and work hard to do that work behind the scenes to help you move along and focus on what's important, your health and your progress, that's part of our why. That's why we do a lot of the work that we do. Terry.
Thanks, Sally. I like Sally's analogy of the duck on the surface. If you just visualize that, I imagine a lot of you in this room feel like that in your job because you're trying to keep that calm, cool, collected front, whether you're dealing with the patient or maybe dealing with a provider. But underneath the surface, you're working fast and furious to get things done. I'll take your water analogy and move it in another direction. Because from a sales standpoint and a marketing outreach standpoint, think of it like a building wave that is just building up and it's going to crescendo. And that wave is really the communication, the information that providers need about the medication. They likely know about the therapy because they've been keeping up with journals, they treat this patient population, they know what's coming, but what they don't necessarily know is how to prescribe. Is there a hub support or not? Are there bridge programs? What are the nuances and details to get this therapy that I've been studying about, reading about, into the hands of the patient that I want to treat with it? And that's where our sales team outreach comes into play. First, we need to use databases to identify who are these providers. And we have, because as George mentioned, we've been in the field of oncology for over 30 years, we have a very extensive internal database when it comes to finding the right oncology providers. Now we're in rare disease as well, and so that sometimes requires sourcing externally for a database through agencies like IQVIA or Symphony or Definitive Healthcare. We also look to the partnership with that pharmaceutical manufacturer to cross-reference their leads. We want to see who are they targeting, how does that lead list match up to what we've sourced internally and externally. We cross-reference all of that information to make sure that we are going to get this message out to all of the likely potential prescribers. The fourth piece, I think third piece up there, is understanding clinical trial sites. When we have a new therapy coming to market, those medications were used in a phase 4 clinical trial site before FDA approval, and those locations are typically going to be the initial source of new patient starts. Many of those patients are going to need to transition to a commercial dispense, and understanding how they do that, how they go from the clinical trial where the medication was provided to now being dispensed under the patient's insurance, is a process that our team works to identify the right people in the clinical trial site and provide them education on how biologics can help. And then finally, advocacy groups. Advocacy groups, I will say for biologics, is probably a newer frontier for us, where we are really starting to understand how important advocacy groups are, particularly for rare diseases, because these patient cohorts are so spread out. They really can use technology through the internet, through Facebook groups, through advocacy groups to share information and learn what are the new treatments that are coming out. So as a sales organization, it's important that we're also connected with advocacy groups. So once we've identified the who that we want to reach out to and the communication that we're going to provide, then there's the how do you go about it. I'm sure all of you are probably on LinkedIn. Maybe you get information from medical journals that you subscribe to. We use those channels. We also have a Facebook page. We do a press release on our Biologics site as well as our broader McKesson site. All of that communication paired with our automated marketing email campaigns. These are metrics where we can put the word out at the push of a button, and sometimes it's difficult to identify, though, did it get to the right person. We can look at click-through rates and sometimes see engagement from these campaigns, but it may or may not have reached the targets that we wanted it to reach. So it's important that we also layer in the outreach of our sales team, because they have relationships with sites that have been working with us for years. They typically can communicate with the person in the office via email. That's probably our primary mode of communication. So think about yourself. If you're in a clinic setting, you don't have time to necessarily stop and answer the phone, but you can read an email at your convenience when you have a break in the day, and we find that that's just a really efficient way to share new product information, how to prescribe, what are the programs, et cetera. We also do have a field-based remote sales team that face-to-face meetings, if those can be conducted. Sometimes it happens over a breakfast, a lunch and learn, even dinner meetings or roundtable sessions. Face-to-face is always best because you're going to learn something that you didn't necessarily learn over the phone or over email. So we try to do that as much as possible, particularly with those clinic trial sites or what we have identified as being likely high prescribers of that medication because they have a high patient population for the indication. So after all of those activities really are happening from the day of FDA approval until over the next 30 days. It's a fast and furious duck paddling under the water occurring. At the end of that 30 days and ongoing, the collection of data, the collection of feedback, the analysis of what's been happening is critically important. Sally's team is looking at payer feedback, rejection codes, hurdles that we encountered. George's team is providing feedback to the manufacturer, also gaining feedback from their teams with what they're hearing from providers in using this medication. And then through the sales team, were we able to reach the prescribers that we thought were going to prescribe? Did they actually prescribe? Are there prescribers that we didn't think would prescribe but did? Or prescribers that we had hoped to reach and weren't able to? So there's a constant analysis and going back and repeating this communication so that no stone is left unturned, so to speak. And ultimately what's driving us is that inner why that George talked about, that if we don't do this work, there may be a patient who doesn't hear about this medication and their condition goes untreated. So we definitely feel that it's a purpose, it's a passion, it's what drives us in our daily activities. So I think that brings us, to the end of our session. The three of us have talked a lot. We'd love to hear from you guys and see what questions you have, whether they're related to the conversation or anything else. I'll give you this one. Yeah.
Couple back there, yeah.
The first one is the farthest back. Good job.
Okay, who had their hand up?
Hi, my name is Joanne Rishpan-Harris, and I am a local here in Las Vegas, so you can ask me anything.
Good to know.
So I work with a lot of specialty patients. I work with Friends of Parkinson's. I work with Ehlers-Danlos patients. I work with Sjogren's patients. And we have a comorbid condition that happens. It's called mast cell activation, if nobody's heard of it or whatnot. So I often have my patients ask me, I can't take this because of the coating on the pill. So my question is here, do you have, or have you looked into trying to solve this problem for specialty patients?
So your question is about the challenges by, focusing on the therapy that is, addressing the disease specifically, and then having other sort of comorbidity challenges that you have contraindicated therapies?
Yes.
Yeah, and we run into that frequently. And frankly, some of these products that we support have rigorous REMS requirements also that we have to navigate to ensure that, there are certain elements of their life that aren't going to be impacted by a therapy that is potentially toxic. To your specific examples, I don't have any exact solutions, but we do deploy a team of pharmacists within our organization, shouldn't be a surprise as a pharmacy. But that team's very focused at that initial engagement with patients to assess what are the therapies that you're on, right? We don't want to have any contraindications, some of that standard review, but also to understand more deeply the individual's experience, right? We do a really deep risk assessment for challenges that may present, likelihood for noncompliance because of things like certain therapies that you are on. But it is a huge challenge, right? You have a comorbid condition that arises that conflicts with your ability to pursue a therapy that may give you some relief from the disease that you're fighting. And it isn't an easy solution, right? These contraindications are going to just create more problems than there are answers. So it is a great call out of challenge, right? But as a pharmacy, the best thing that we can do is to interject ourselves to ensure that the patient is aware of that challenge and that they're not introducing that further challenge by pursuing with contraindicated medicines. So we can get out and be that line of defense to ensure, and then referring them back to their physician, right? I mean, their physicians are always going to be the voice of truth for what the best path forward therapeutically is for the patient. And as a healthcare provider, we play a role in ensuring the right product is for the right patient, and quickly, if we can. But we are always going to guide that patient back to ask those complex questions to their physician so that they can really help them address or reassess maybe what the best path forward is as comorbidities do arise. Great question, though.
Thank you.
You got one back over here?
Thank you for the wonderful session. This question is specifically related to rare diseases because you're inherently dealing with very few patients. The co-pays are really through the roof, like one of the highest that we have seen. So when you are looking at patient support programs for rare diseases, is there a separate thought process, or is it like most of the regular hub services that have been providing the services, they also do it for rare diseases, or it's like a completely different thought process with trying to work with different set of expertise? How do you go about rare diseases in particular?
So with financial challenges related to rare disease patients, let's address the other side of the coin that probably helps answer what you're asking is on the oncology side of the business, where we have tremendous experience working with 501c3 charitable organizations to offset out-of-pocket burden. And they're typically, the funding is there, right? It's well-funded. Pharma contributes. There's opportunities. It varies in its availability, certainly, which is a tremendous challenge. But the funding is often there. And in rare disease, it's often not. So we have to get creative in working with the community, right? And I think Terry mentioned that is a real mission of ours, and our colleague Daniel Weaver is here today, and he plays a critical role in fostering relationships with the community advocate groups and helping work with pharma in my role to say, are you going to help fund this in some way, right? So there's a growing understanding that that's going to be needed, but we don't leave any stone unturned in terms of trying to find alternate avenues for funding. Because the out-of-pocket burden can be truly a financial toxicity, right? Patients can't stay on therapy if they can't afford it. And if they can't afford that, they can't afford a lot of other really important things in life. So working with us, working with pharma to help them, see a commitment to finding alternative ways to fund patients with out-of-pocket burdens, working with existing community groups and foundations to source and find applicable funding to offset out-of-pocket burden. That's the focus for us as a pharmacy today, because we do deploy those funds as part of the pharmacy process to bring the out-of-pocket down at the point of therapeutic dispense. So we can shape that perspective as much as we try to, and we work with the great advocate community, especially in the rare disease side, to help establish maybe a foundation that could receive funds so that we can urge pharma to help contribute to that. So that's really the best way that we as a pharmacy can help try to shape that and find an opportunity for patients to not start there because they can't afford it. Right behind you.
Hello, thank you so much.
Sure.
Quick question in regards to your payer space and your contracting. Now, you're a specialty pharmacy, so I'm assuming you're already working with CMMS and you're doing all that. You're going after the big three, and then you're working your way down through like centers that company is working through particularly. But say you get a new product, you're the only one that distributes that product. Is your contracting like, are you starting from the base up? You're like, hey, we have to go back to the table, pretend like we're new because it's a new product, whether it's the HPS code or the J code or anything? Or are you working off your existing contracts and say, hey, Cigna, Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, we're now getting this product. Can we now add this into our licensing or whatever with you? How is that really working?
Great question, thank you. As my colleagues can attest to, and I need a ribbon that says, it depends. Unfortunately, it often does depend on who the payer is, what the drug is, and what's going on as it relates to that contracting. More often than not, when it relates to our commercial payers, we are working off of existing contracts that we have in place. So we continue to kind of add and grow onto those and develop onto those. So it does help us so that we're not starting from scratch every time, and we're able to just kind of continue to add and grow onto that. Depending on the payer and whether our contract is something that is more global or whether it's something that's more drug specific, that timing and how quickly we can actually get that put together varies. It also varies based upon the payer. Some are really quick with the negotiations for us. Others take a little bit longer if we're having to negotiate at a drug level. Medicare is kind of like its own separate beast, and so it really kind of comes down to how's that drug going to be covered? Is it going to be something that's under Part D, and what does that look like? And then that ties back to each of the different patients' plans and what they cover and where it sits on the formulary. Medicaid, again, another beast unto itself, and actually 50 different ones because they're not all the same. Their rules are not all the same. Their philosophies around things and how they support is also not the same. When it comes to state Medicaids, a lot of them actually have what we call kind of like brick and mortar rules or geographic in-state rules where they require the pharmacy to be an in-state provider. From our perspective from Biologics, we're what's called a central fill provider. So we're able to actually ship medications out to the patients. We do not do this blindly. We do not schedule and just ship. We actually talk with the patient, we coordinate, we make sure that they know when the delivery is coming and the expected date. So because in many instances we do have some of these exclusive products, we aren't located in every single state. And we do have to actually work with the state plans to request that approval, provide information, provide the letters of exclusivity from the manufacturer, provide some additional information about the drug in order for them to see and understand what it is, help give them some of the criteria and the information related to the drug, so they make that decision in terms of adding it, and then they'll also make that decision to, like, quote, approve us to be able to dispense it, even though we are not physically located in their particular state if they have some of those rules. So it's, again, it's kind of a lot of work and a lot of hoops, and it all sort of depends on who the payer is, but we hit on all those different parts, and my team is diligent about jumping on top of these, particularly with the state plans, so that we can get those approvals right away where we know we are working with a restricted state and we do not have a physical presence in that state. Thanks, great question.
I think that's probably our last one. We're out of time. Can we do one quick one? Okay, who had their hand?
Thanks for squeezing me in. Hi, I'm Emily. I am a patient with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and also endometriosis, and the partner of someone with long COVID. And I was just wondering, through this entire timeline that you laid out, what are the steps that patients themselves can take to support the development and, the approval and everything else of getting some of these therapies to patient groups faster?
Great question, because patient involvement and advocating for yourself and your fellow patients is critical. And I would say find an opportunity to collaborate with pharma, right? I mean, and when we engage, a lot of the rare disease programs that we're supporting are often for diseases that don't have any therapeutic options. And these manufacturers have dedicated individuals who are focused on working with the patient community. And that is by far the best way to get your stories, your perspective, funneled into the manufacturer and then subsequently to the regulators so that the product can get approved quicker and get out into the world. I can say from my role working with biopharma, some of the most rewarding aspects is learning from folks like you. Right? People who have been, on the front lines of navigating the challenges that you live with, and how to really bring that into scope for the folks that are bringing therapeutic options forward. So that's how I would recommend getting involved with pharma, finding those liaisons, engaging the communities, advocacy groups, but certainly helping shape their opinion is going to have the most ultimate impact on that product, ultimately making its way to market. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for your time today. I hope everybody has a great conference.